Thank you, Michael, for coming out here and being a part of this. His book gets into a lot of the stuff behind the scenes during his time in the White House, and it's going to be back there for purchase when we're done. And it gets a lot into your personal testimony as well, which would be great. One of the things I thought was missing through the book, and you kind of pick it up in some of the articles, but I just want to kind of get a baseline, because you don't talk too much about your positions. You talk a lot about the president's positions. And as an evangelical, I just kind of want to get a baseline on kind of where you were on some of the stuff. The Atlantic said you're pro-life, support a traditional marriage. Those are correct, right? That you support religious freedom. We saw that in SB 1146. I know that's really important to you. So you hold those beliefs and you hold those passions. So tell me why you found a home in the Democrat Party. And you worked with President Obama when a lot of those things were at odds with either his agenda or the DCC's agenda. So
I think I alluded to this in my remarks, right? So when I started working for the president, when I thought about what party I wanted to affiliate with, when I could register to vote, I knew that neither party was going to be completely comfortable for me. There are a number of reasons why I became a Democrat and why I worked for the president. My first sort of political commitments, the first sort of issues in which I got involved directly in political action were civil rights. And so it means something that Democratic Party defends the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act. Democratic Party is not trying to dismantle voting rights in a state like North Carolina, where documents came out and showed that there was targeting of laws to make it harder for African Americans to vote. So that was important to me. Also support comprehensive immigration reform. I support robust international development because I think that America has a place of moral leadership in the world. Within the party, well, let me say two things. One, it's important to remember that in 2008, and in the president's campaign, the president, in his first campaign, he did something pretty novel for a Democrat. At a time when secularists were arguing that there should be no role for faith in public life, Barack Obama gave a speech in 2006 that called that a practical absurdity, he called it. He said that whether you look at Dorothy Day or Martin Luther King, you cannot ignore the role that faith has played throughout America's history in driving important reform. And he said that that same capacity exists today. And so he kind of shut down the secular wing of the party. The other thing he did was he, within his, and I have an entire chapter on this in my book, which is at the height of his political capital, he went to Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame. I had an alum of Notre Dame. Apparently in a speech, I called it Notre Dame University, and it's the University of Notre Dame, and he took great offense at this. It was a very, very big flub, apparently, but the University of Notre Dame, and he called for reducing the number of abortions in this country. And I talk about the policy effort that followed after that and how both sides kind of failed, but the fact of the matter is that today, at the end of the Obama administration, we have the lowest abortion rate in our country since Roe v. Wade, which is something that, if you believe that, as I do, that unborn life is life, then to have a low abortion rate is something that we should celebrate. And so I knew very early on that there were things that we disagreed on, but there were also positive things to affirm in the Democratic Party.
Did you feel like you could be salt and light in the White House on those issues, on issues of life and marriage and religious freedom? And talk about how you were received maybe in the White House on those issues?
Yeah, I mean, so right, when you understand, when you work, no one elected me. So I was there to serve the president. Now what that meant was particularly since I was in the faith-based office, part of my role was making sure he was hearing from people who disagreed with him on those issues. And so that outreach process gave me an opportunity within the scope of my job to make sure that diverse voices had a seat at the table. It was not my job to sort of work outside of my lane to sort of, when I started working for the president, I knew he was pro-choice. And so that was something I knew going in. And when you work for a elected official, it's very important not to get confused who the elected one is and who's and who is signing up for to advance what agenda. Now, when I left the White House, as you know, I took multiple opportunities to use my private capacity to speak directly to the administration and to the Democratic Party. One of the ways I did that was, for the first time in 40 years, the Democratic Party put a repeal of the Hyde Amendment on the party platform. And so I wrote an op-ed in USA Today using my status as a Democratic staffer to reject the party's call to repeal Hyde. I co-wrote that op-ed with Russell Moore of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, I was able to use my role to make sure that diverse views were heard, and sometimes my argument lost, sometimes it won. It's the times I won that people will never hear about because the actions didn't happen. And then since I've left an official role with the party or with the White House, then my calling and my responsibilities changed.
Great. I want to talk about the Hyde Amendment and the Democrat Party platform in 2016. So it was arguably the most pro-abortion platform in history, calling for the repeal of Hyde and Helm amendments. The LA Times said that this marginalized 21 million pro-life Democrats. In your book, one of the most fascinating parts of the book is the contraceptive debate. The president meets with Cardinal Dolan, indicates that there's going to be no issue on religious freedom and contraception, and this has to do with the HHS mandate, what later became the Hobby Lobby case and now the Little Sisters of the Poor case. You kind of make the case in the book that Cecile Richards turned the contraceptive mandate around within the White House. Does Planned Parenthood control the Democrat Party?
I'm not quite sure. Here's what I could say. The idea that we were the president's sort of agenda and the way that the president and the White House approached that issue, that there were sort of allies to the White House and those who were not allies to the White House involved was clearly a present thing. What I try to emphasize in the book, though, is it's important not to. So in the book, I walk through 5 chapters of discrete controversies. My aim in doing that, I have 2 aims. One is to play into the historical conversation of the Obama administration. There are some former staffers and others who are claiming, well, Obama, the president made the best shot possible at bringing the country together. If he couldn't do it, no one could. And part of the reason why I walk through these controversies is to show that actually at discrete moments, positions were taken to stoke controversy as opposed to bring folks together. The contraception mandate is a clear example. The second reason why I walk through those controversies is to build mutual empathy. I want Democrats to understand that you can't sweep every religious criticism of the president under the rug of animus or party politics, that there are substantive disagreements that should be taken seriously. On the religious side, it's important that we deal with the reality as it is. There were not people in the White House who were waking up every morning asking, how do I destroy the church today? That was not the drive of the contraception mandate. The drive of the contraception mandate was an idea that the more women that have the easiest access to contraception, and we have an employer-based health insurance system, so that's the delivery mechanism, the more women that have access to contraception, the better it's going to be. That's a government interest. That is where the debate should be located, not on sort of these action alerts and Obama trying to take God out of government and kind of all this stuff. Now, right, so I say that, and then I also say they did an awful job of weighing the interests. That I don't think that the interests of, as the Supreme Court said in the Little Sisters of the Poor case, you don't have to infringe upon religious liberty to get these women access to the medical services that you want them to have access to. That there are clearly other options available. So why are you putting these employers in this position when there are other mechanisms of doing so? So that was the issue there. Certainly there are political interests in the same way. Let me see if there's a way that I could say this without sort of violating. In the same way that I would imagine that the head of the NRA would get a heads up and might be called in for a meeting to make sure he approves of any gun-related issue that comes through the White House, liberal interest groups, especially those that pour tens of millions of dollars into political campaigns, get the same treatment.
I do want to stay on this issue, and I want to go back to it just a little bit. You have Cecile Richards right next to Bill Clinton at the DNC convention. You have the most pro-abortion platform in the history. A strong indication that she turned the entire thing around in the book. I mean, that's the sense I get after Cardinal Dolan meets. So has the Democrat Party entirely abandoned the pro-life community? I mean, at what point? I mean, it seems like, let's use the NRA example. Most Republicans would proudly say that they're glad to stand with the Second Amendment, and that's not something they're going to shy away from. So is there any room left in the Democrat Party for pro-lifers? And if so, how does the Democrat Party deal with this?
Yeah. Well, so in 2004, after losing again the second time to George W. Bush, Rahm Emanuel took charge of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And in his recruiting for candidates, he made a pretty controversial decision, and that was that in districts that were more conservative, he was going to recruit more conservative Democrats. And the activist wing of the party didn't like this because they didn't want there to be room for this political columnist, Mark Shields, has this great quote. He says, you could tell the health of a party by whether it's searching for converts or whether it's searching for heretics. In 2006, we were searching for converts. It was the 50-state strategy. It was every voter. In 2008, as I mentioned, we were searching for every voter that we could. The party is in a state right now where it's searching for heretics. So you have senators like Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp, Claire McCaskill up for re-election in red states, with the exception of Senator McCaskill. So Joe Donnelly, Bob Casey, Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Manchin, I believe were the only four senators to which they should be applauded for it, but I wish there were more of them to oppose the Democratic platform's position on Hyde. After the 2006 election, we had dozens of pro-life Democrats in Congress. Now they've been eliminated. I think there are three in the House. And so yes, it's getting very difficult. Here's the pivot point. The Democratic Party right now is basically split up into three equal thirds: a third white Christian, a third non-white Christian, and a third religiously disaffiliated or from minority faiths. But the minority faith section is a small minority of that third. About 48% of African Americans are pro-life. Just under half of Hispanics are pro-life. You have party leaders increasingly saying that the base of our party are from diverse communities. So at some point, you would think, especially after we just lost an election, if you listen to the rhetoric of NAACP and National Council La Raza, these of a president who is directly a threat to their interests, you would think that there will be a presenting moment where these communities say, well, look, you say that we're increasingly leading the party, so why is it the view of the wealthy, secular white folks, why is it their view on these social issues that we're taking and not ours? Why are we giving up votes to do things like repeal the Hyde Amendment that even if Hillary Clinton had won would have never, a budget isn't passing unless they had also swept Congress too. But it was a meaningless, symbolic thing to put on the platform. And that alone, listen, in Michigan, I believe the difference was 19,000 votes, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, 19,000 votes. If Hillary Clinton would have matched Barack Obama's 2012 numbers among white evangelicals, she would have picked up over 140,000 additional votes. Just matching his 2012 white evangelical numbers. I was there doing evangelical outreach in 2012. Was not so. That's not like a high water mark. And so this is the conversation we're going to have as a party. The last thing I'll say is that we were ready after 2004 to ask some hard questions about the God gap and how we were thinking about social issues. The reaction to our loss in 2016, I've said liberals are reacting to this election like conservatives always react to losses, which is usually when conservatives lose, they say, well, the Republican Party wasn't conservative enough. Democrats that's usually not our reaction. 2016 it is. We lose an election. What do we do? We put up every activist group for marches in the streets and present that as the face of the Democratic Party as if that's going to win a national election.
So you're not convinced that the current strategy is going to set them up well for midterms?
No.
I see on the Babylon Bee that we're going to have a day without a protest. So, fascinating chapter on President's evolution on gay marriage. I'd like to ask you, could you end it with a reflection not only on the president but on culture itself? And I kind of want to read this so people get a context. You say that Axelrod wrote that the president personally supported gay marriage as early as 2007, so before he ever ran for president, but believed it was not politically feasible to express this view. A few pages later, you quote Chris Hayes when he says that it was something truly rare that happened. We've got to look at the inner workings of a premeditated, politically calculated, and justify the means lie. It involves candidate and then President Barack Obama knowingly, willfully misleading the public. So you don't mix your words on your view on that. But then this is where I want to just get your comment on this section. You write, but the more serious issue is of a spiritual character. If we are to take seriously the president's comments in 2008 about his faith and convictions regarding marriage, what new biblical revelation came to him in those intervening years? In courting Christian voters, whose importance to his political future is evident not just in the numbers, but the very fact that he courted them, the president repeatedly invoked not just his analysis of the Constitution and of policy preferences on the question of marriage, but his convictions about his own Christian faith. And when he announced his support for same-sex marriage, he implicated Jesus' own words about love, some of the most widely known teachings in the world. Surely he knew those teachings in 2008. What about the teachings of marriage he summarized as God is in the mix? Let me read that again. What about the teachings about marriage he summarized as God is in the mix? Where did those go? Is God no longer in the mix? And then you close the chapter by saying, our republic relies on an informed citizenry, and if that citizenry cannot only be openly manipulated, but also have that manipulation openly embraced and celebrated. So you're kind of criticizing the fact that he was being a bit manipulative, and then but then it was also openly embraced and celebrated. How are we to encourage citizenship? What then does citizenship even mean? Can you elaborate a little bit on that critique? Because it's not just on the president's evolution, which you criticize, but also on the culture's embracement of that.
Yeah, well, I labored over that paragraph, so I don't have much to add to that. What I will say is we have to be really careful, and by really careful, I mean we need to reject ends justify the means politics. There was this sort of, well, I will say this, because I think I made this a footnote in the book. There were the White House hosted a screening of Spielberg's movie Lincoln, that sort of shows some of the deal making Lincoln had to do to advance emancipation, and there was sort of this sort of trying to analogize it with sort of the misdirections that were given out apparently about the president's views on this issue. And listen, that's not how a democracy can work. It's very difficult, in my view, for Democrats who defend, and this was Chris Hayes' point. Chris Hayes, MSNBC reporter, he posed a question to a liberal: how would you feel if a libertarian who opposed the minimum wage ran for president, said he supported the minimum wage, and then when he got into office, worked with the Department of Labor and others to undermine the minimum wage during his time in office? We can't have a government if the burden is going to be on the people to decipher whether their politicians are telling them the truth or not. Now, to some extent, that has always been the case, right? There's a civic responsibility there, which is what makes it so problematic to then have the misdirections of politicians to be praised as smart politics or a fight for justice. And I think we're seeing this with President Trump now. Oh, isn't he so sort of smart with the way that he doesn't really show his hand on what he thinks about this or that? No, it's not. How are the people supposed to? How do we have a representative government if the representatives don't show their cards on what they plan to advocate for? And the president ran in 2008 talking about how he was going to tell the truth about how we're going to raise the level of civic dialogue, and in many, many ways he did that, which is why I thought it was important to write a chapter on this issue, which, unless he clarifies in his memoir, unless he outrightly rejects David Axelrod's claim, then clearly a decision was made that in this case, shooting straight wasn't imperative.
I want to ask two more questions, and we'll go to the audience for questions. One of the most interesting polarization moments is you contrast Louis Giglio and Rick Warren. So Rick Warren, same positions on marriage. Rick Warren welcomed during the first inauguration to be a part of it. You seem to really be, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me, but you seem to be hurt by what happened to Louis Giglio. I think you had worked with him on sex trafficking issues. And if you guys don't remember this, Louis Giglio was initially invited to provide the benediction at the second inauguration. Then they found out that he had spoken out against gay marriage, so they uninvited him. And you talked in your initial speech about the problem of polarization that's happening. And I felt like that was a great example that is very near the end of the book of the polarization that happened over the 4 years within the Obama White House. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, just to summarize, 2009, Rick Warren, who had invited then Senator Obama to his church in 2006 for World AIDS Day, who they had a friendship. 2009, the president-elect Obama made a personal decision to invite Rick Warren to the inauguration, understanding that Rick had just publicly campaigned for Proposition 8, which passed. So he was politically active on LGBT issues. And the left kind of got a little upset, thought that the president-elect was legitimizing the kind of religious figure that shouldn't be legitimized anymore in this country. And the president went to the podium in December and said, look, Rick and I disagree on a range of issues, that we deeply disagree on a range of issues, but he's done a lot of good work, and we've worked together on AIDS and global poverty, et cetera. B, we have a big, diverse country. Rick represents a lot of people, and this inauguration is not a political rally. It's a ceremony for the whole country. And so the fact that we live in a big, diverse, inclusive country was reason to include Rick. 2013, Louis Giglio, who was someone who was courted by the White House in many ways. Louis is not a political guy, unlike, not to say Rick is hyper-political, but Louis doesn't put out videos telling people to vote on certain issues or that kind of stuff. Louis has a church that mostly serves young kids, teenagers. He runs the Passion Conference, which is for college kids. And him being asked to give the benediction in the 2013 inaugural was a through line of the president and the White House working with him on anti-human trafficking efforts, which is something that Louis had taken a leadership role in. We asked him to come to the inaugural. He wasn't trying to vie his way into, that wasn't his thing. If he wants to speak in front of a crowd of 100,000s or millions, he could get that on his own. He's doing fine. Liberal Blog found a sermon he gave 20 years ago to a youth conference, and the same kind of thing. This isn't the kind of guy, blah, blah, blah. What was different this time is a statement was put out not from the president, but from the inaugural committee that basically said, and in the book, I'm sorry I don't have the quotes in front of me, but you can buy the book and see the full quotes. Basically, it puts the two statements, you put the two statements up against one another, and the language is strikingly similar. It opens, we live in a big, diverse country with people with different views. Only in 2013, it was, we live in such a diverse country that we couldn't dare have someone like Louis who could potentially offend some people. So it was a complete, virtually the same situation, and as I would argue, between the two, Louis given a sermon, the person who gave the invocation in 2009 was actually mobilizing people for political activity. But in 2013, the fact that we were a big, diverse country meant that we have to sort of smooth out, erase, ignore difference, even on issues that the public is still wrestling.
Right. I'll enter with my last question here about co-belligerence. That's something that's a value that we both share. Co-belligerence is the notion that we may disagree on a lot of things, but you find the areas that you can agree on and you work on those and you move forward. You join with a lot of conservatives, including Colorado Christian University, and against Democrats in your own party, in calling for the abandonment of SB 1146. This was a very serious issue raised in California, where the state legislature sought to strip public funding primarily through grants and scholarships for Christian colleges. There's 42 Christian universities in California. There's only 2 here in Colorado, so we're watching this very closely. And you could see that this was very dangerous to the Christian colleges. Biola mobilized against it, kind of led the fight. Our alma mater sent out emails about it, Westmont College, and basically they were all there. But you joined with all of them, and Colorado Christian University. The letter said that to ensure the future of the free exercise of religion in higher education in California and across America, we respectfully call on the supporters of Senate Bill 1146 to immediately withdraw their support of the bill with the commitment to disavow similar intrusions in the future. So, you even called that this wouldn't ever come up again and that you would protect the rights of Christian colleges. So talk a little bit about the importance of believers finding ways to work together, even if we disagree on other stuff, and the importance of co-belligerence. Maybe even a Wilberforce reference if you want to.
Yeah, well, here, the questions in this country are becoming a lot more fundamental. And if we don't see that we need to work together where we can work together, instead of focusing on particularly some of the trivial kind of stuff that comes up, then we're not going to have the effective witness in politics or as a church that we should, if we end up keep being divided by these particularly partisan issues, so that we can't even partner with the other side because we're afraid of helping the Democrats or helping the Republicans. It's not going to serve us well. Religious freedom is under pressure in this country. Now, it's important to understand that we need to invite people into the conversation. So Barry Corey, who was the president of Biola University, he didn't start yelling at people, calling people pagans. Like he actually built relationships and made sure that if there were legislators that were going to harm the religious freedom of institutions like his, they were at least going to know his face. They were going to know what, the legislators that proposed that bill had never visited a Christian campus before. They didn't have a frame of reference. An advocacy group says, hey, this is a great way that you could help LGBT folks, and so they're not thinking about the consequences. We need to help them. This is actually, we need to think about the rise of religious disaffiliation in this country, the presentation of these new questions, not as reasons to be fearful or to be anxious. This could potentially be the greatest evangelistic opportunity that we've seen in this country for a long time, because for a long time, people are coming to Christianity and to religious conversations without a whole lot of baggage from their past. They are one, sometimes two generations removed from faith. They don't live in a culture that is soaked with Christianity, so they don't have presumptions about what it is. We need to actually help our neighbors understand what it means to have a religious conscience. It's not animus that they don't understand what it means to have a religious conscience. They don't know. And so some will be resistant to hearing that, but I would much rather pursue these debates, with as broad a coalition as possible, and that is across Christian denominations, and then increasingly I think we're going to find opportunity to partner with those of other faiths, because again, the questions are no longer Catholic, Protestant. The question is religion or not. And then we can do so. Dallas Willard is one of my favorite teachers. He has all these ways of defining words. Dallas Willard defines joy as a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. In the year leading up to the election, at the end of my events, I'd ask people how many people felt that the campaign was full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. But we can be joyful in politics. We can be joyful even in religious freedom contexts and in a culture that seems to not be as welcoming perhaps as it was before. We can still be joyful. We can, because we don't find our security in what the California legislature does, as important as it is. We don't need to be anxious about these things.
Great.